Some technical difficulties, but I think we're only a minute late, so let's get started. On behalf of NIOSH-supported education and research centers throughout the country, we're pleased to present the 2020 Ergonomics webinar series, offering free monthly webinars on various topics on human factors and ergonomics. This collaborative effort on behalf of each ERC's continuing education program aspires to provide access to current research supported through NIOSH ERC programs. So thank you for joining us today. I would like to announce a couple of upcoming events. We have the creative use of direct reading instruments presented by Dr. Thomas Peters on April 7th at 12 p.m. Pacific time, and a couple of COEH free webinars, March 30th, I believe it is, at 12 p.m. Pacific time, protecting workers in the service industry during the coronavirus pandemic. And also the impact of safe patient handling legislation in California, presented by Dr. Sue Jong Lee on April 1st at 12 p.m. as well. Okay, so that's it for upcoming. You will be muted during today's presentation, but if you'd like to ask a question, please do enter it into the online Q&A, and we'll have some time at the end to address any questions. The webinar will be recorded and archived for viewing on our YouTube channel, COEH Northern California's YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe to help us grow our audience. And you can just Google COEH YouTube channel and you'll find us pretty easily. Okay, so today's webinar, the impact of a scope stand on biomechanical exposures during simulated colonoscopies, is brought to you by NorCal ERC and COEH. Our originally scheduled speaker, Dr. Amandeep Shergill, is understandably very busy on the front lines at UCSF with the current pandemic, but we are very fortunate to have her co-author, Dr. Carissa Harris-Adamson, presenting the same data on her behalf today. Dr. Harris-Adamson is an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and in the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley. She's also the director of the UCSF UCB Ergonomics Research and Graduate Training Program, and the deputy director of the Northern California Center of Occupational and Environmental Health. Dr. Harris and her team perform research in a variety of areas focused on understanding and preventing work-related injuries and improving human performance, productivity, and health. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Harris-Adamson. And you are currently muted.
For the introduction. Want to acknowledge Alan, as he's a co-author on this project as well. As Alan mentioned, this project is largely driven by Dr. Amandeep Shergill, who is an endoscopist and also received her MPH at UC Berkeley in the UC Ergonomics program. And for good reason, has a lot of interest on the biomechanical exposures during simulated colonoscopies. So I have no personal conflicts of interest to disclose. The UC Ergonomics Research and Graduate Training Program is supported by these companies. So today we're going to talk about the prevalence of work-related musculoskeletal injuries in endoscopists. I'm then going to describe some of the physical exposures associated with the performance of colonoscopies. And then I'll discuss the potential role of a new device that was designed to mitigate these exposures during colonoscopies. So there was a survey done back in 2009 that really tried to identify the scope of the issue of musculoskeletal disorders among endoscopists. Overuse injuries of the hand, wrist, forearm, and shoulder were found to be quite common. There were 684 respondents with a mean age of about 51 years. The majority were male, which is typical given that the majority of physicians that are endoscopists are also male. 53% experienced an injury that they perceived to be related to endoscopy, and 18.5% of those required time off work. And 54% required some sort of modification of practice. So clearly, based on these numbers, musculoskeletal disorders and report of pain is a problem that needs to be addressed among endoscopists. So I'm going to show you a little bit about what colonoscopies look like. This is obviously not a person, it's a model. And the first project was really designed to really quantify the biomechanical risk factors associated with upper extremity MSDs while performing a colonoscopy. As you can see, this is Dr. Amandeep Shurgill, who's demonstrating what it looks like to hold the colonoscope in the left hand and then to have to manipulate some tubing in the right hand. So the first project was done by the authors mentioned, as well as Dr. David Rempel, and it included 12 endoscopists, 8 male and 4 female. They performed up to 4 colonoscopies each on actual patients. The total time of the colonoscopy, including some of the different portions of the colonoscopy were recorded. And the difficulty of the colonoscopy was also recorded by each physician during each patient that they were treating. And so I just wanted to mention, for those who maybe are less familiar with what a colonoscopy is and the different phases, for this project, they looked at the time of insertion into the left colon. And so that would be putting the scope all the way up through the rectum to sort of the top left corner of the colon. That would be the sphenic flexure. And then the insertion into the right colon covers the time for the scope to go across the transverse colon through the ascending colon all the way to the very end at cecum. Once the endoscopists get to cecum, then they're actually going back through something called withdrawal, meaning they're withdrawing the scope through the colon. And that takes a bit more time, because during that withdrawal phase, they're actually looking for polyps. When they get to the very end of the rectum, they go into retroflexion, which is where they essentially do a U-turn with a scope in the rectum to get a view of the anal rectal verge. So for this project, we looked at thumb force using pressure profile system. Bilateral thumb force was measured. EMG also measured the muscle activity of the forearms, including the extensor carpi radialis and the flexor digitorum superficialis. We looked at peak muscle activity, analyzed using amplitude probability distribution functions, where you identify the percent of time or the percent MBC at or below 90% of the time. And we looked across phases using repeated measures ANOVA. We wanted to identify some risk thresholds that we were looking for. So we identified an MVC above 30% as a risk threshold for the forearm. And we also utilized a thumb pinch force of 10 newtons as a risk threshold for thumb pinch force. These 12 endoscopists had a mean age of 42.3 years. There were 8 men, so 67% were men. You can see that the mean height and weight was 68.9 inches and about 161 pounds. BMI was about 27.7. And the glove size was 7.2, which means, you know, they had larger hands. When you look at mean duration, I think it's important to identify that insertion, whether it be in the left colon or right colon, took on average 3.5 to 5.8 minutes. And then withdrawal was typically twice the time of the insertion at 13.7 minutes on average, with retroflexion being the shortest portion of the procedure at an average of 1.2 minutes. And so I want to draw this out because, you know, on average, these procedures took about 24.2 minutes, and just about half of that, or a little over half, was in the withdrawal phase. When we look at peak muscle activity, you can see that the extensor carpi radialis and flexor digitorum superficialis on the left side being the hand that is holding the scope, were all quite high. And then the right side also saw some peak muscle activities that were high, but not as quite as high as the right side. When we compare the left and right side to that 30% MBC threshold, you can see that both the flexors and the extensors of the forearm on the left side were exceeding that 30% threshold, whereas the right side was more in the 12, 15 to 20 range. When we look at thumb force, we're going to look at thumb force by side, and you can see the thumb force for the total colonoscopy, followed by the left and right insertion, then withdrawal and retroflexion. The peak thumb forces on the left ranged between 10 and 15 newtons of force, and the mean force was roughly between 5 and close to 7 newtons of force. But what this doesn't tell us is the percent time, and so I think it's important to acknowledge that there's quite a bit of time spent in more than 10 newtons of thumb force. And this is important given that some of the more recent epidemiological studies have found a increase in risk for those individuals who spend more than, say, 11% time in forceful exertion. And you can see that these endoscopists were spending 16 to even 20% of their time pinching above 10 newtons. Another thing of interest of ours was comparing men to women. So the scopes have not been redesigned in some time, meaning the size of the scope has been pretty consistent over the years. And yet there's more and more female physicians, and particularly female endoscopists. And so what's important to note is that, this one colonoscope might not necessarily fit men and women the same. And we see this come out in differences for their peak thumb force, mean thumb force, as well as percent time spent above 10 newtons. So for each of these, you can see by phase of the procedure, the peak thumb force for men and women, and you can see that women on average are typically quite a bit higher in their peak thumb force as well as their mean thumb force, and they're spending a lot more time in pinch above 10 newtons. So the times that you're seeing for the women range from 16 to 34%, whereas the men really never get above 18% of time spent in heavy pinch. For the right side, as we would expect, since it's not holding the scope, muscle activity is a lot less, and we don't see the muscle activity on the right side being as problematic, although it's still very active, and you can still see that the percent time spent above 10 newtons is actually quite high for that right thumb force. And that's because they're pinching a hose, which has the camera obviously on the end, and they're manipulating that hose and torquing it to be able to get the view that they want and sort of assist what they're doing with the left hand through the dials. And when we look at the right thumb, you can see that the peak thumb force and the mean thumb forces are all quite a bit higher, particularly the peak thumb forces are all quite a bit higher in the women. You can also see that the percent time spent above 10 newtons is really high for both men and women. The men are right around 30% of their time spent in more than 10 newtons of pinch, and the women, they're spending 40 to 44% of their time in more than 10 newtons of pinch. So from this study, we've concluded that the left wrist extensor muscle load exceeded the established thresholds during all the phases of colonoscopy, and the left flexor digitorum superficialis or flexor muscles also exceed that established thresholds of risk, particularly during insertion. I think what's more concerning is that the thumb forces were really quite high for both the left and the right side. And so there were peak forces well above the 10 newtons. The mean force was close to or even exceeding 10 newtons, especially in women. And that, you know, the left thumb spent about 16% of the time in more than 10 newtons, and the right thumb spent about 32% of time in more than 10 newtons of pinch. Additionally, we see that women tended to exert 2 to 5 newtons more thumb force than men, and spent about 10 to 15% more of their time in more than 10 newtons of thumb pinch force. And again, these numbers are important, given that in epidemiological studies, we've seen thresholds of increased risk of, say, carpal tunnel syndrome when people spend more than 11% of their time in significant or heavy hand grip or pinch. So these exposure values are very high, and certainly lends to something more being done to reduce these types of exposures. Some of the limitations of this study was, obviously, it was a small sample size and at a single institution. There could be differences in across institutions that were not captured. And we only evaluated the distal upper extremity biomechanical risk factors, and we really didn't look at things like the neck or back or shoulder. From this study, we think that mitigation of biomechanical exposures during colonoscopy could be done through alternative handling techniques. So more work could be done to compare techniques of scoping across individuals. We could potentially mitigate the exposures through support mechanisms for the scope, and certainly begs for alternative colonoscope designs, particularly for women or people with smaller hands. So this brings us to the second study that I'll talk about today. This study is to determine whether a stand used during an entire procedure, part of the procedure, or not at all, reduces muscle activity, awkward posture, fatigue and discomfort, and productivity. And so for muscle activity, we looked at neck, shoulder, forearm, wrist, and thumb. And awkward posture, we looked at the neck, shoulder, and forearm, wrist. And so you can see Dr. Shergill demonstrating how the stand works. Essentially, the colonoscope is placed into this stand that is placed right next to the bed and supports the weight of the scope. Participants were recruited from the San Francisco VA and from regional Kaisers, and the inclusion criteria was that they are a practicing endoscopist, and we excluded anybody who was off work due to a musculoskeletal claim. We used a colonoscope training model for this project. As you can see, this model has a soft, flexible, and airtight material that allows realistic colonoscope insertion and withdrawal. We also placed magnets inside the intestine, and that was to represent polyps that the endoscopist had to find during their simulated procedure. So I'm going to show you a couple of videos that just demonstrate the different techniques. So this would be the technique of someone utilizing the stand. You can see how the stand is positioned next to them. We allowed them to place that stand in whatever position was comfortable for them. It was placed so that it was next to the bed. It really doesn't change what their right side is doing at all, but it does have a significant change on the left side. Okay, this is what it looks like with partial support, meaning during the insertion phase, they support the colonoscope using their typical method. And then as they get to cecum and they get ready for the withdrawal phase, they put the scope in the stand so that they can really take their time going through the colon looking for polyps. And so this was thought to be significant because of the increased time spent during withdrawal versus insertion. Okay, and then this is what it looks like, at least for this physician, doing the simulated colonoscopy without any support at all. So you can see that this particular physician keeps his elbow around 90 degrees and his hand somewhat neutral, though moves it around, and is holding on to the colonoscope with the left hand the entire time. So this is the setup of the room. It was in a typical room. They could view the monitor as they would during a normal procedure. And, you know, they could set up the bed to the height that they would normally set it up for themselves. And, you know, other than the person not being there, it really was set up to be similar to what a regular procedure would look and feel like. So we first gained informed consent. We provided a baseline survey. We then set up the surface EMG and IMU. We did a calibration for both of those. And then the order of conditions were randomized. They performed a simulated colonoscopy in one of the 3 conditions. We measured muscle activity. We measured joint information or kinematic data, as well as the duration of the procedure. And we gave them a survey after each condition, asking them about their experience in that condition. And then after they completed all 3 conditions, we gave them a comparison survey. We used Qualtrics to assess subjective fatigue, their preferences and rankings for each of the conditions. And we used myomuscle Neuraxon surface EMG, collected data at 1500 hertz. After processing and smoothing the data, we normalized the data to each person's maximum voluntary contraction. We measured 3 muscles to assess neck, shoulder, arm activity. Those were the upper trapezius, the anterior deltoid, and the biceps brachii. For the forearm wrist, we measured 3 muscles, the extensor digitorum, the extensor carpi radialis, and the flexor digitorum superficialis. And for the thumb, we measured the extensor pollicis brevis and the flexor pollicis brevis. Now we measured them on each side. For today, I'm going to go over the left side, which is where we saw the majority of the findings. Okay, so for the inertial motion capture, we used 3D motion capture using inertial measuring system from XM. This is 17 inertial measuring units placed on various segments across the body. The data from the 17 IMUs are integrated and provides us joint range of motion, velocity, and acceleration data. And so today I'm going to present to you the percent time spent above certain thresholds. So we looked at the percent time spent in more than 30 degrees of shoulder flexion, more than 30 degrees of shoulder abduction, more than 15 degrees of wrist flexion, more than 30 degrees of wrist extension, more than 15 degrees of radial or ulnar deviation, and then again, the percent time spent in more than 15 degrees of pronation or supination. And so we chose these thresholds both based on the literature as well as you know, thresholds that seemed reasonable given the task. We used repeated measures of analysis of variance to evaluate the differences across conditions. And we used a Tukey test to assess for differences while adjusting for multiple comparisons. So for this project, we had 19 individuals. There was an average age of 46.5 years. 14 or 63% were men. You can see the BMI was around 25.7 and the glove size was 5.6. So years of practice was, that's actually an error. So let's look at hours per day. The hours per day was about 9.5. The average hours spent per week on procedures was 22.6 hours, and the average number of procedures per week was 29.3. So the majority of our endoscopists were spending quite a bit of time per week on actual procedures. When we asked about discomfort, their worst discomfort in the past week, we found an average of 3.5 on a 0 to 10 scale, and their worst discomfort in the past year was a 5.5, again on that 0 to 10 pain scale. So first we wanted to look at productivity. Of course, whenever we test a new intervention, we want to make sure that it's feasible from a productivity standpoint. And so here you can see the three conditions: using a stand for the entire procedure, using the stand for part of the procedure, and not using the stand at all. And you can see the three phases. So the insertion phase, the withdrawal phase, and the time spent for the entire procedure. So that would be insertion plus withdrawal. And so what you see is that using the stand really didn't have too much of an impact or negative impact on productivity. It took about 12 seconds more for an increase of about 3% more time. And of note is that they had a little bit of time to practice, but certainly, not as much practice as they've had with not using this kind of intervention. When we look at thumb muscle activity, this would be for the left hand, you can see that there was a decrease in thumb muscle activity for the flexor pollicis brevis, as well as the extensor pollicis brevis when using the stand for the entire procedure compared to the control. Although there were some reductions in peak muscle activity of the thumb muscles for both the FPV and EPV, these were not statistically significant. We did see significant reductions when using the stand for all or even part of the time for mean flexor digitorum superficialis. So that would be a forearm flexor for the wrist, as well as the extensor carpi radialis and the extensor digitorum. And we also saw a reduction in peak muscle activity for the flexor digitorum superficialis when comparing use of the stand for the entire procedure versus not using the stand at all. When we look at the neck, shoulder, and arm, again, we see a reduction in percent MBC for mean muscle activity, both in using the stand all of the time or part of the time compared to not at all. And we see the same pattern for the biceps brachii, meaning there was less muscle activity of the biceps brachii when utilizing the stand at least all the time or part of the time. Of interest, you'll see that the deltoid, anterior deltoid, was actually reduced in the control. So that meant that there was actually an increase of anterior deltoid muscle activity when using the stand some or all of the time. And that was a little, that was a little bit of a surprise, but we can talk about it in a minute. And we saw the same thing for peak muscle activity. So again, upper trap and biceps brachii muscle activity went down when using the stand, but it went up when using the stand in the anterior deltoid. When we look at the percent time spent in awkward postures, different joints, you could see that there wasn't a ton of change. We had some wide confidence intervals, which minimize the statistical significance in some of these comparisons. You do see that there was a reduction in the amount of supination, or the percent time spent in more than 15 degrees of supination when using the stand relative to no stand at all. When looking at the wrist, both flexion extension or radial or ulnar deviation, there weren't any statistically significant differences. We do see a little bit of increase in percent time spent in some of these deviated postures when using the stand. But it's important to note that this is an awkward posture, and they don't have to actually support the weight of the stand. So, you know, there's less force that is concurrent with these postures. As far as preferences go, we asked them what their preference would be for things like ease of use, accuracy, speed of work, and you know, the majority of people felt that their usual method of not using a stand was the easiest, the most accurate, and the fastest. I, you know, just want to say, take this with a grain of salt, and because these physicians were not actually able to use this for a prolonged period of time or practice with it for a prolonged period of time. So we would see, we would expect to see things like accuracy, speed of work, and ease of use improve when using the stand with more practice and use. What was interesting was that when we get to comfort and least amount of exertion, you can see that roughly 2/3 preferred either the stand or partial use of the stand compared to no stand at all. And there was pretty much an equal split of people preferring the usual method versus preferring use of the stand either all the time or part of the time. So some of the limitations is that we only were able to collect data on one trial per condition for the majority of the practitioners. This was due to the time that it required on the physician's part, and a lot of them just didn't have enough time to be able to do multiple trials per condition. The joint range of motion was heavily impacted by calibration. This doesn't have an impact on within-person comparisons across conditions, but it might lead to some inaccuracies relative to the joint thresholds that we looked at. And then, of course, the simulated colonoscopy can have some important differences, you know, when compared to actually using a stand on a patient. Some of the conclusions that we found from this study was that there really was no significant change in productivity. There were some minor increases of time when using the stand for the entire procedure. There was actually a reduction of time when using the stand for only part of the procedure, but we also didn't see as many reductions in muscle activity when, you know, using that stand for only part of the procedure. So I think, you know, we saw better results when the physicians used the stand for the entire procedure, and it really came at a very little cost relative to productivity. We did see a reduction in the percent time spent in more than 15 degrees of supination. And again, even though some of the deviations or percent time spent in deviations saw an increase when using the scope stand, you know, that was fortunately in a position where they were not supporting the weight of the scope. And so it's, I think, taking into account the fact that there's more concurrent exposure of awkward postures with forceful exertion when supporting the whole weight of the colonoscope is something that I think is an important distinction. We saw a reduction in mean muscle activity. So 7 of the 8 muscles showed a 3 to 6% reduction when using the stand versus no stand at all. We also saw that the extensor carpi radialis and flexor digitorum superficialis showed reductions when using the stand, particularly for withdrawal. There was some reductions in peak muscle activity, and the only thing that increased in muscle activity when using the stand was the anterior deltoid. And I think that might be because they were reaching forward to reach the scope stand. You know, when they didn't have a stand, they often, one technique was to really let the arm sort of hang by the side in line with gravity. And, you know, I think when there's a scope stand there, they do have to flex the shoulder to be able to engage with the scope. Most users still prefer the usual method when it came to accuracy, ease of use, and speed of work. But about 2/3 of the users preferred the stand for some or all of the procedure when it came to comfort, reduced exertion, and overall preference. I think this is important given the really high prevalence of musculoskeletal discomfort and injuries among this population. I think, using something like this, like the support stand during some or all of the procedure is an important design feature to retain. What we saw was an equal split in people who preferred using the stand during the entire procedure versus just part of the procedure. So, giving them the ability to choose how they use some sort of support device, I think is an important feature to keep. So we want to acknowledge the various awards and support that was provided for the 2 projects. And at this time, I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Dr. Harris-Adamson, for an excellent talk. I do have some questions here. I'll just read these to you. I think you have access to them as well. But can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Was EMG data used to capture, this is relative to the first study, was EMG data used to capture thumb exertion duration measures?
Okay, so if it's the first study where we looked at the thumb force and that 10 Newton threshold, that was used using the pressure profile system. And so that was a little bit different. The only EMG data that we collected during that project was of the forearm, and that was one extensor group, one extensor muscle and one flexor muscle. So we were able to look at the force using the pressure profile system over time.
Okay, the second part of that question was what risk analysis was done to account for the effect of muscle recovery rest periods, like micro breaks?
We really did not look at micro breaks or the effect of muscle recovery. We didn't look at patterns, if that's what the person's asking. We really looked at the entire procedure and then looked at the percent time that the pinch force was above that 10 Newton threshold for the entire procedure.
Okay, have there been any comparison studies looking at muscle activation or fatigue between the use of the artificial colon versus a real patient?
Ooh, that's my knowledge.
I want to say that Amandeep, well, she's only spoke really to the validation, I think, of the device as a training tool. So I'm sure there's some literature out there that the audience members could dig up if they'd like further information. But I think it is a validated tool for training, which may answer that question. Has the endoscopy industry considered the viability of exoskeletons during endoscopies?
Well, actually, Alan, you guys, you did a 0G, you looked at the 0G, didn't you, as far as supporting the scope? There was only a couple of, I want to say maybe 3 endoscopists in that project. Do you recall what the issues were?
I don't, actually. I do recall having Dr. Shergill at the laboratory here at Berkeley to look at the 0G. I just don't remember if we looked at it formally. And so this is a load balancing device, but with respect to exoskeletons explicitly, I'm not sure either if that has been looked at. I think it's something we had discussed, certainly, but formally,
yeah,
don't know.
Yeah, I agree. So there was a pilot, right, that Dr. Shergill did, and why that wasn't pursued, I think she'd have to answer that. That was, some years ago. Certainly, there's been some changes in exoskeletons, and, I'd have to get Dr. Shergill's feedback on whether or not, what the pros and cons potentially would be of using the different types of exoskeletons that are out there, whether it's supporting the scope or supporting the physician. I have to say, one thing that was really interesting was that one of the physicians who was older, who was a participant in the study, mentioned that at a prior job, there was a counterbalance that was in each of the rooms that would support the weight of the scope. And for whatever reason, those counterbalances are no longer there. Not sure if that, he thought potentially that was because of, issues with cleaning them, et cetera. But, certainly the weight of the scope has been a problem for a long time. And, at some point in time, counterbalances were used.
Has the study been published?
No, not yet. But Alan and I and Dr. Shergill will be working on that.
That's right.
Yes,
Another question, did the study identify any user interface or human factors, parameters on improving the stand design? Did we collect any data?
Yeah, we did. I didn't have time to share some of those specifics, but we did ask a lot of open-ended questions about what they liked about the stand and things that, they felt could be improved. So we'll be sharing that, as we write up the project and get the information out.
Okay, well, we've got a few more rolling in here, and we're doing great on time, so I'm just going to keep on keeping on, if you don't mind. Stand by. To increase my screen here. Okay, so this is a comment made. There's a question built in here, but I'm just going to read it verbatim. I've just completed an 8-hour observation of endoscopists. I'm waiting to receive discomfort data, but anecdotally, most people have complained about right wrist and right shoulder more than the left hand. I did not see anything on right wrist or right shoulder. Did you have any information about that? And what is the title of both of the research studies?
Okay, I think that was a lot of questions. So can you give me one of them? I'm not seeing where that is.
Sure. The question really is, it's actually in the chat. Sorry, and the question really focuses on anecdotally, this person has heard more complaints about the right shoulder and right wrist, and we presented the data on the left. Do you have any information on the right? Will you be including that in your paper?
Sure. So for the first study that I presented, we did see, some really high pinch forces. In fact, they spent a higher percentage of their time in greater than 10 newtons of pinch on the right side versus the left. And so some of that makes sense in the sense that the left hand is more in a mass grip supporting the colonoscope, whereas the right hand is really, pinching the hose and maneuvering it. We actually did not see in the second study, the reason I didn't show the right side is because the muscle activity was actually quite low, and there wasn't as much differences from this intervention on the right side, which makes sense. We were a little surprised in the sense that we thought that having the colonoscope supported in the stand would allow people with smaller hands in particular to be able to reach all 3 dials. And if they could reach all the dials more easily, then arguably they don't have to do as much torquing with the right hand. And so we were thinking there might be some interaction there, but we didn't actually see that. Now, whether that would change with people having more time to practice and figure out how to optimally use the colonoscope on the stand, I'm not sure. We just didn't have enough data to look at that.
Okay, here's another one for you. This one is not exactly relevant to the stand, I don't think, but however, maybe you can answer this. It might be outside of the scope here. But the position of monitors, the guidance for positioning the display seems to be based on low resolution monitors. With the introduction of high resolution HD monitors, has that guidance been changed, or will it be changed? Or I think that's the essence of the question.
You know, that would be a better question for Dr. Shergill. I'm not exactly sure how those have changed and how that's, you know, whether or not there have been any recommendations or changes in recommendations based on the new monitors. It does seem that at least in the rooms that we were in, there was a lot of flexibility to move the monitors around both in height and distance. You know, I was also quite surprised with, there's still a lot of complaints on musculoskeletal discomfort of the neck. Even in our second study, which was just, you know, which is more recent, when we looked at, when we asked the question of their worst musculoskeletal discomfort in the past week versus the past year, more of them, there was more than I would have anticipated in the neck. So clearly that static gaze over to a monitor is really important. And I can make sure that we maybe address that in some of the papers that we put out.
Great. Last question I see here is about the stand. Was it fabricated for the study? And is it available for purchase somewhere or to try?
That's a great question. I believe that, so it was not fabricated specifically for the study. It was fabricated for, you know, use in the field. It was going through a process to be able to be used in the OR, and, you know, I'm not exactly sure where they are with that. Pentax is the producer of the stand. So, you know, it would be worth reaching out to them to see if it's available for commercial use yet.
Okay, well, that is it for the questions I can see in front of me here. And so I suppose it's time to wrap it up. I just want to say thank you very much for an excellent presentation and filling in for Dr. Shergill. I'm sure she'll be happy to see this presentation on YouTube at a later time. And you all can also share this or go back to review it on YouTube on our channel. And for more information about upcoming webinars, please visit coeh.berkeley.edu, and you can learn about some of the excellent work that's being done. I will remind you that we have a webinar coming up on March 30th at 12 p.m., particularly relevant, protecting workers in the service industry during the coronavirus pandemic. That's March 30th at 12 p.m. Pacific time, so please join us for that. Again, that's it, and thank you so much for everybody attending, and wishing everyone the best, and we'll see you here next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Stay well.